Thank you very much. And now, turning to our main event, Hermann Wygoda was born in Germany to Polish Jews. Already an adult and a father when the war began, Hermann was able to use his unique skill set and remarkably brazen personality to shape his fate and that of others as well. In some ways, Hermann's journey was like a Hollywood thriller. But the world came very close to never knowing this story at all. Firstly, because as a Jew in occupied Europe, Hermann had many narrow escapes. But even after the war, Hermann never spoke about his experiences. We can only assume that the trauma was too great, and the words too difficult to voice. Hermann did, however, write a memoir, handwritten in Polish, the first chapters penned while living in a cave. And it was through this memoir that Hermann's son, Dr. Mark Wygoda, came to know his father's story. Dr. Wygoda was moved to publish his father's memoir and has spent more than 20 years sharing it with audiences at home and abroad. We are very privileged to have him here to share this story this evening, so please help me in welcoming Dr. Mark Wygoda.
Thank you. I think I turned it on. Okay. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Good. I first want to thank the Institute for Holocaust Education for bringing me here all the way from Louisiana to talk to y'all, and also the Center for Faith Studies for hosting this event. Can you hear me now? I can hear me. Oh, maybe this microphone is in the wrong place. Can you hear me now? Okay, it was a little low. Okay, my father, Hermann Wygoda, came to the United States in 1946. He married in 1947. I was born in 1951. Now, growing up, I knew next to nothing about his life in Europe before he came to the United States. And that's because he never talked about it. And before I share his story with you, I'm going to tell you why I think, and I'm sure he never talked about it. This picture was taken on my 8th birthday. And you can see how happy I was in that picture, but look at my father's expression. His thoughts were clearly elsewhere. It was a very strange look on his face. Now I know, on my 8th birthday, he was thinking about another son that he once had who was murdered when he was 8 years old in the Treblinka death camp. I distinctly remember the first time I ever learned of the existence of Samuel, and that was his first son. I must have been 4 years old, is my best guess. I was in our parents' bedroom. My mother was in there doing something, and all of a sudden I came face to face with this little photograph in a frame on the nightstand on my father's side of the bed. And I turned to my mother and I said, "Who's that little boy?" And she said, "That was your father's first son. He was killed in the war. Don't ask him any questions." So I didn't ask him any questions. And then later, my sister Sylvia told me my father's entire family was killed during the Holocaust. And I didn't ask him any questions when I was a young child. I was too scared to ask him anything. And then later, as I grew up, I continued not asking him questions because then I wanted to spare him the agony of remembering what happened. So I didn't question him on that. The only time I remember asking him anything was when I was in about the 4th grade of school, and the boys out on the playground during recess, they were talking about what their fathers had done during the war. And of course, that was World War II. Well, I went home and in all innocence said, "Dad, what'd you do in the war?" And we were in his office, which was in our home. He opened a drawer and he pulled out several photographs. That's a photograph of my father, the one with the binoculars. It was taken during the war. He told me he was a guerrilla fighter in Italy. And I had no idea what he was talking about. So he explained to me that the guerrilla fighters were, as today we know them as partisans. He explained to me what a partisan fighter was, fighting behind the enemy lines. I asked him what was his rank. Did he win any medals? So out of that drawer, he pulled this little uniform patch with the 2 gold stars on it, showed it to me. He had saved that from his uniform, and he told me he was a lieutenant colonel. And then he showed me the American Bronze Star Medal that he was awarded. About the only other thing I remember asking him was he ever wounded? And he said yes. He pulled up his pant leg on his right leg and showed me the back of his leg. There was a scar where the bullet had entered. And he led me to believe that he had been shot and wounded while he was fighting with the partisans. But later I found out, no, he misled me. He had been shot a few years earlier in Poland during a failed attempt to rescue his son Samuel. He intentionally misled me on that. And so he didn't really talk about anything other than to answer my few questions. But fortunately for me and my family and for all of you here tonight and for many other people who I've spoken to, he was able to write about his experiences. And his memoir of the Holocaust has to be, if not the first, but one of the very first ever written. He began it in 1945. He was living in a cave in northern Italy. And he started his journal. Sometimes I refer to it as a journal, sometimes a memoir. But he started writing it back to the first day of the war. September 1st, 1939 is how it begins. He wrote about all his experiences up to the current time, and then he kept writing it, kept updating it as the war continued, kept it up a little bit after the war until he came to the United States. It's written in Polish. I can't read a word of Polish. But fortunately, after he came to the United States and learned English, he knew no English when he came here in 1946. 20 years later, he translated his entire memoir into English. And he typed it all himself and left an unpublished manuscript when he passed away. Well, about a dozen years after he passed away, I decided that I had to get his memoir published. The world really needed to know his story, and a good way to do it was to publish this as a book. So I spent quite a long time editing his English version, and this was the result. The book, In the Shadow of the Swastika by Hermann Wygoda. I am on as the editor. This was published by the University of Illinois Press. So now that, with a little background, I will now start at the beginning with my father's life. Hermann Wygoda was born in Offenbach, Germany on November 18th, 1906. His parents were Hannah and Meyer Wygoda. Wygoda is how Wygoda was pronounced in Europe. The lady holding his hand was his mother Hannah, and the other lady was one of her many sisters. Her name was Goldie. Well, after Hannah's husband was killed in World War I fighting for the Germans, she took Hermann and his younger brother Leon back to her hometown of Warsaw, Poland, which was 50 miles to the east of Warsaw. He must have been 12, 14 years old at that time. Here's a picture of Leon as an adult with Hannah, their mother. Leon stayed in Warsaw working as a cabinet maker. He married and they had two girls. Now my father grew up in Warsaw. He attended Warsaw Polytechnic Institute and he became a civil engineer. He took his first job back in Germany, in Berlin, in the middle 1920s. But he left, came back to Poland in 1929 because of all the rising anti-Semitism he was witnessing back in Poland, he married, and the couple had a son, Samuel, in 1934. Now, they later separated, and my father raised Samuel with the help of his mother, Hannah. They all lived in an apartment in Warsaw. Now, my father, in 1939, he knew war was imminent. He knew the war was coming, and he felt it would be safer for his son, Samuel, and his mother back in Warsaw. So he sent them to Warsaw to live with Leon and his family, and he remained in Warsaw working, and he was there when the war started. He survived the bombardment of the city, he survived the siege, and he watched as the first German troops marched into the city after Warsaw surrendered. And this is a photo I found of German troops on that day marching into Warsaw. My father was somewhere there watching this when it happened. And almost immediately, anti-Jewish laws started becoming enacted in Poland. Now, the laws that took, 6 years to fully be developed in Germany, it was in a matter of weeks in Poland. My father refused to obey all the laws. He would not submit to the Nazis' demands. Instead, he went underground. He assumed the identity of a Catholic Pole, but not just an ordinary Catholic Pole. No, my father, he pretended he was a Volksdeutscher, someone who had Aryan ancestry. The Germans had high regard for the Volksdeutschers. These were not German citizens, but they were Germans. And that was his disguise. It worked. He credits his success to his language skills mainly. He could speak German with no trace of an accent at all. And that saved his life many, many, many times. But it also saved the lives of some other people as well, including some people in the Warsaw ghetto. He became a smuggler to the Warsaw ghetto. This is a picture I found of the Warsaw ghetto. As almost everyone in here knows, the Germans forced all the Jews in Warsaw and in outlying cities and towns and villages to move into this special section of downtown Warsaw that they surrounded with a wall and topped the wall with barbed wire. And it became a prison for the Jews. At the height of the Warsaw ghetto, there were 500,000 people living in there. Before the war, in that neighborhood, there were 145,000 people. And people were dying all the time, disease and starvation. What my father would do would go in there and obtain valuables like gold and diamonds and furs, take them out into the countryside, sell them to farmers in exchange for food, and then he would smuggle the food back in. He kept up this smuggling operation for about 2 years. And he never really said in his memoir exactly how he got in and got out of the ghetto. Only he said he used secret passageways that were reserved for professional smugglers only. That's how he put it. But he did talk about what he saw when he was in there, about all the misery and the death and the dying. And every time he left, he wondered whether he'd have the courage to go back in there again. But he kept going back. He said the ghetto pulled him in like a magnet. Even after his friends died in there, he kept going back with food for others, especially for the children, that he would take food in there. Well, in July of 1942, he had been away from Warsaw for a while. And when he got back, a friend of his, this man shown here, his name was Stanislaw Gorczyca. He was a real Catholic Pole. He was a postal worker. That's all I know about him and his name. But Stanislaw told my father that if he was going to go into the ghetto again, this time he needed to be extremely cautious. He said strange things were happening in the railroad station, the Danziger railroad station, the closest one to the ghetto. He said the Germans were assembling all available freight cars there. And strangely enough, they were covering the air vents on those cars with barbed wire and heavy boards nailed it on the outside. No one knew except the Germans what was going on. Well, my father went into the ghetto again. But this time he said the situation was very different. There was a lot more tension in the air. And whenever a German patrol was spotted, everyone ran for cover, including my father. He asked the people, what's going on here? What's going on? They told him that lately those German patrols had been shooting into the crowds indiscriminately. Then he saw in the distance what looked like a large group of Jewish men and women being led by Germans, and everybody ran. He barely made it through a doorway in an apartment building before the door was slammed shut. He was in the foyer of an apartment building and crowded with people, and every once in a while he would make his way through the crowd to the front door to look through one of the peepholes. And what he saw outside was a column of Jewish men and women, he said 18 to 20 people wide, being marched in the direction of the railroad station by German guards with bayonets fixed to their rifles. He said it took about 40 minutes for this whole procession to pass by. And when that was over, he went back out into the street. He began to doubt the wisdom of him being there, but he went on to the place he usually took his food, only to be caught up in another crowd of people running like crazy. This time he witnessed the murder of a young Jewish man out on the sidewalk by a Nazi SS officer, and that convinced him to leave and not come back. It was just too dangerous for him to be in there. Now, I'm going to go back in time about 2 years, momentarily, around 1940 or so. My father had a run-in with the Polish police in the town of Warsaw, where his family was. And he was a wanted man by the police. If they would spot him, they would kill him, and probably kill his family too. So he could not visit his family very often. It had to be in secret, special times. He did see them every once in a while, but he was cut off from them because of this incident he had with the Polish police. And sometime after the incident I just described about the Warsaw Ghetto, the Germans liquidated the ghetto in Warsaw. They took his family away to Treblinka, and they were all murdered. He wasn't with them. And his inability to save them just haunted him for the rest of his life until he died. Well, sometime after that, he found himself working at a German border patrol station in the town of Tiraspol, Poland. And he was working alongside this man. His name was Leon Pergol. He was a Jewish man. And Leon and my father made a very good team that assured their mutual survival. Now, Leon's talents came from the fact that before the war, he was a photographer and an artist. And with his talents, he was able to doctor stolen ID cards beyond detection. That ID card that you see is an ID card that Leon carried in 1943. And that picture is Leon. Look how evil he looks in that little picture. That was intentional. My father described Leon as a master of disguise. And you look at that picture, who would suspect that that was a Jew hiding in plain sight that looked like that? Now, my father's contribution was his language skills and his bold nature. He was incredibly bold. And I'm going to give you one example of how those skills helped both men survive. They were working together at this German border patrol camp, and they received word that someone was suspicious about them and was going to turn them into the Gestapo. They left. They boarded a passenger train bound for Warsaw. And along the way, they received word that in the town of, at the railroad station in the town of Lukaw, the Germans were taking people off the trains. This was March of 1943. The Germans needed more labor for their war factories back in Germany. And they were resorting to making slave raids into Poland and taking Polish citizens off into slavery. The Jews were, many of them were slaves now, many of them were dead. Others were on their way to their deaths, but they needed more labor. So that's what was happening. At the last railroad stop before Lukaw, my father got out of the car, the train car, called Leon to follow him, went out onto the platform and looked around, and in the middle of the train that they were on, he saw 2 railroad cars reserved exclusively for German citizens. And with no hesitation, he walked into one of those cars, Leon with him. Inside, there were 4 Germans, 2 of them civilians and 2 of them were military men. He greeted them with the Nazi salute and then sat down. He and Leon sat down, made themselves comfortable, and immediately my father started talking to these Germans. Leon just sat there holding his chin like this, pretending that he had a toothache, so he didn't have to talk. He knew very little German. And as the train pulled into the station in Lukaw, my father says he and the Germans were engaged in a loud and lively conversation. Well, this is the station. It still exists today. And the train was now stopped on those railroad tracks you see. As soon as the train stopped, a loudspeaker issued orders, first in German and then in Polish. Now, the Polish message was, everyone out of the train. Leave your car doors wide open. Take all your belongings with you. Report to the main waiting room in the station. Failure to obey, you'll be shot to death. But the message in German had been very different. In German, they told the passengers, stay in your cars, lock your doors, don't let anybody in, we'll be leaving shortly. So all these poor Polish citizens were being taken away, and my father and Leon just sat there with the Germans in that car. It took about a half an hour before the train started moving again, and during that time, a conductor came by and greeted them with a Nazi salute, apologized for the inconvenience, said we'll be leaving shortly, and he wished them well. And then the train takes off for Warsaw. And that's just one example of how my father's skills got them out of that situation. Well, soon after that, both men went together to the last place you would expect Jews to go in Nazi-occupied Europe, and that was Berlin. Okay. This was 1943. Why Berlin? You don't expect Jews to go there. That's why they went. There they worked for a labor recruiting company, and at times my father worked as a translator for them. At other times he was a foreman, and other times he was an armed courier taking company documents and money to different places in Nazi-occupied Europe. One of the trips he made as a courier took him to far northern Finland. And on that particular trip, he took with him a Jewish teenage boy who he discovered in a group of new company recruits, and with a fake document filled out just the right way by Leon, he left the boy there in a place of relative safety. Now, in his job as a translator, they assigned him to a mining camp under construction in Estonia near the town of Jovi. He asked his bosses, the company was owned by 2 German businessmen, they were both Nazis, asked them to have Leon transferred there too. He claimed Leon was his cousin. So Leon joined him at this mining camp. And they thought about escaping to the Russian front, but they gave up that idea when a couple of other fellows tried. They were caught by local hunters, brought back to the mining camp, and they were hanged in front of the company office. Well, after about 6 weeks there, my father asked his bosses if he could take a leave of absence for a few days. And they agreed. He wanted to go back to Warsaw. He said he wanted to visit his friends and also see if he could help get anyone out of what he called that terrible place. Well, he arrived in Warsaw during the final week of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. And the day he arrived there was May 12th, 1943. That was the day the Germans set fire to the ghetto to drive out the remaining resistors. And He watched what he called that desperate but unequal battle out a window from an apartment right across the street from the ghetto. He had a friend named Frank who lived there. Then, with the help of Frank and Stanislaw and the Polish underground, he got 2 teenage Jewish boys out of Warsaw with fake documents, took them back to Jovi and left them there, a place of relative safety. Soon after that, both men were reassigned to the company headquarters back in Berlin, and my father was constantly aware of the dangerous situation he was in, especially because right upstairs there was a Gestapo unit in that office building, and every day he would pass the Gestapo agents in the stairwells. He was terribly frightened, but he never showed a trace of fear whatsoever. He and Leon, they knew they needed to get out of Germany. They'd be discovered sooner or later. Their ticket out of Germany, so to speak, though, came thanks to the Allies. The Allies were bombing Berlin now. And after a particular bombing run, their company that they worked for was given the contract to clear out the rubble from a bombed-out government building. And my father was put in charge of the job as a foreman. He was given 100 men, but he went in first to snoop around. And he found what he was hoping to find: blank ID cards, blank travel documents, and official government stamps. So with these documents filled out properly by Leon, the 2 men boarded a passenger train and they arrived at the Mediterranean port city of Savona, Italy in December 1943. This is a contemporary photo of Savona. Now, this was the time when the Germans were occupying northern Italy. Still, they felt relatively safe there, but my father wanted what he called complete freedom, and even though Leon tried to talk him out of it, he planned his escape to the island of Corsica, which was then occupied by the Americans. He bought a motorboat, and he hired 2 ex-Italian Navy men to navigate, and he got weapons on the black market. He said he was not going to be taken alive. But in the early morning hours of February 12th, 1944, he was arrested in his hotel room. Now, this wasn't his first arrest. He'd been arrested twice before in Poland. The first time was by the Polish police in Warsaw, and I alluded to that earlier, a problem with the police in Warsaw. His second arrest was by the Jewish police in the ghetto in Sokoław, another town. The Polish police had arrested him to fulfill a labor quota that was mandated by the Germans. Now, getting out of these earlier arrests was very easy compared to this one. This time he was arrested by the German secret field police, which is the military equivalent of the Gestapo. 5 men, a captain, a lieutenant, and 3 enlisted men made the actual arrest, and other soldiers stood guard outside. They took him downstairs, put him in a German staff car, drove him to the military garrison in Savona, questioned him for hours, and then locked him in a cell. He escaped that night. And he went up into the mountains to the northwest of Savona. And it was in those mountains where he learned from local farmers the reason the Germans had used such elaborate precaution in arresting him, why they treated him with a lot of courtesy, why they just didn't take him out on the street and shoot him, and that's because they thought they had captured a famous British spy that was supposed to be in the area. Well, I got that wrong. Well, he lived in a cave. It's shown here where this arrow is, a very tiny cave up in the mountains. And it was in that cave, he was in that cave when he was approached by a group of heavily armed men, and he knew who they were. They were the partisans. They asked him to come with them, and of course he went with them. They took him several miles away to a house where he met a high-ranking officer in the Italian Liberation Army. And that officer convinced him not just to join the partisans, but to assume command of a detachment that was active in those mountains. He agreed, and thereafter he became known only as Comandante Enrico, Commander Enrico. All the partisans went with assumed names. He picked Enrico. And here's a picture of Comandante Enrico in the middle of this photograph. And in the background, you see that dark area. That was his mountain cave. He turned that into his command headquarters. Now, he was put in charge of a group of 117 young, inexperienced freedom fighters. Most of them were teenagers. They were not very successful. Well, he whipped them into shape. He instilled discipline in those troops, and he provided the training that they needed. And soon they found themselves becoming effective. In the beginning, they were only fighting with single-shot rifles, but it wasn't long before they were fighting with captured German automatic weapons. And then later, with British and American weapons that were airdropped to them by the Allies. In this picture, my father is seen holding a British-made Sten submachine gun. Under his leadership and direction, his forces planted mines, they blew up bridges, but mainly they aggressively attacked enemy convoys and troops that were passing through the mountains. Now, their fame in the region grew, and so did their numbers as more and more local Italians joined. His ranks swelled. He split up his detachment into several different detachments, and then later grouped them together into 4 separate brigades, each with its own brigade commander. He himself assumed command of the 4th Brigade, with a fighting force in his brigade of about 600 men and a few women partisan fighters. Now, as a partisan commander, he had the power of life over death. His usual procedure for dealing with captured Germans was to personally interrogate them and then order their executions. He said not for revenge, but instead to carry out an act of justice, the killers of innocent children. That's the way he put it. But sometimes captured Germans proved useful as pawns in prisoner exchange negotiations. And one such negotiation took place directly with the German commander in Savona. I'm going to describe those negotiations to you. My father's men had captured a captain. And I'm going to read to you what my father, his recollection of the message that he sent to the German commander. The parish priest was the intermediary that carried the messages back and forth. He said, I told the padre that we did indeed have the officer and proposed that he take a message from me to the Nazi command. I addressed that message to whom it may concern at the German headquarters in Savona. Their missing officer, I wrote, was in our hands. He was tired, but otherwise well. I explained that we had captured him to trade for our men whom they had in custody, and I assured them that actions such as the taking of innocent civilians from the valley as hostages would not speed the return of their officer. I threatened to execute their officer immediately if any of the hostages or our men were harmed. Also included was a warning that any attempt to free the officer by force would not meet with success. I signed that message with my formal title, Enrico, commander of the 4th Brigade of the Garibaldi, province of Savona. Now, can you imagine how absolutely furious that German commander was when he read this handwritten message in flawless, eloquent German coming out of the mountains? Well, he assumed that there was a German traitor up there fighting against his own people. Well, the German commander proposed a face-to-face meeting with Comandante Enrico to discuss the terms of the prisoner exchange. And my father agreed, but my father picked the time and place. The place was the middle of a tiny bridge up in the mountains. Previously, my father had stationed his best marksmen on the bluffs overlooking that bridge. And when he arrived at the bridge, there in the middle of the bridge was the German commander and the local parish priest. At the other end of the bridge, at the foot of the bridge, there was a German military jeep with a heavy machine gun mounted and several soldiers with automatic weapons. He walked up to that commander, and the two men saluted each other, and they began discussing the terms of the prisoner exchange in German. The priest, his name was Padre Giovanni, stood there and didn't understand a word they were saying. But when my father thought that they had finished with their discussion, that German commander asked him to leave his troops and come join him to fight for the glory of the Third Reich. And my father must have been smiling when he responded by inviting that commander to leave his troops and come join the partisans. But the two men shook hands and then departed. But that German commander never intended to exchange prisoners. This meeting was just a ruse. He wanted to see what my father looked like, so that later, after he was captured or killed, they could identify him. And indeed, that very night, the Germans launched a major assault against Commandante's headquarters up in the mountains. The battle lasted throughout the night, but the German commander's plan to destroy the resistance and kill or capture my father failed miserably. The Germans were driven out of the mountains after they lost 87 men compared to my father's loss of 5. They never again did they try to attack Commandante Enrico. Well, a few days later, Padre Giovanni came with a message from the German commander. He wanted to resume with the prisoner exchange under the same terms negotiated previously. My father flatly refused because of what they did. He demanded additional terms. He knew the winter was approaching. It was now November of 1944. They were living up in the mountains. He demanded that the Germans supply him and his troops with 100 pairs of boots, 100 pairs of wool socks, and 100 pairs of long underwear. And what had to be the most humiliating experience of his life, that German commander complied with all my father's demands in full. Now, as a result of his success in the battle and the subsequent negotiations, the high command of the partisan movement ordered my father to join those 4 brigades in the region together into one single unified fighting force, a division, and they ordered my father to become the division commander. So that's how my father became a division commander in the Italian Liberation Army. Well, the end of the war came there on April 25th, 1945. That's the day my father led his troops down out of the mountains and helped liberate the city of Savona from the Germans. This photograph was taken 1 week later on May Day during a celebration in the town square, and there you see my father is in the middle, is wearing his full partisan uniform. You can see the little insignia on his shirt. That's the little 2-star patch I showed you in the beginning. He never wore that up in the mountains. And you're a commander or a partisan commander. You don't want the enemy to know who you are if you're captured. So he's proudly wearing it now, probably for the first time. Well, before the liberation occurred, he had 200 of his fighters specially trained to become policemen after the liberation. And so at the liberation, he set himself up as chief of police of Savona, Italy, and he had those fighters, his police force. He said he knew the local police. They were corrupt. They were collaborators with the enemy, so he replaced all of them. And my father essentially controlled that city for a couple of weeks until the regular Italian army finally arrived. And then in a ceremony scene here, you see my father standing there at attention. He was transferring control of the city of Savona over from the partisan army to the regular Italian army. And with that accomplished, he tried to settle into a normal life. Well, he became a police inspector for the city of Savona. But very soon, he began receiving awards and decorations, including this one. It's all in Italian, but you can make out the top part, translates as Certificate to the Patriot. And you may notice that they spell his name wrong. we spell our name W-Y-G-O-D-A. They spelled it V-Y-G-O-D-A. And it's not just this document, but he brought back many documents with him, or brought many documents with him to the U.S., and in a lot of them, his name's spelled wrong in different ways. And I couldn't understand why until I started to try to learn a little Italian myself, and I found out that the Italian alphabet does not have the letter W, and it does not have the letter Y at all. So they did the best they could. This was his Italian partisan veteran ID card that was issued after the war, and they spelled his name right up there at the top. This was the first legitimate ID card he carried in 6 years, the previous 6 years. Well, he was in Savona as a police inspector, and then about 12 months after the war ended, this telegram arrived at the police station, and you can see down at the bottom they spelled his name wrong again. It says W-I. But the translation of this is it's asking the person named below to report the next day to a certain address in Milan, Italy, to receive instructions about the receipt of an American decoration for valor. The very last sentence says he's advised to wear his partisan uniform. So my father went, and there he is in the middle. They picked 10 Italian partisan veterans from the entire partisan movement of Italy, and there was about 200,000 partisans. They picked 10 to receive the American Bronze Star Medal on this occasion. It was personally pinned on his chest by United States General Mark Clark. He had been the commander of all the American troops in Italy during the war, and he was then stationed in Austria. He came down to Milan for this special occasion. This was a very special occasion for my father. He decided to come to America because of this. He was given the American decoration. And receipt of that medal made it relatively easy for him to come to the United States also. It was hard to get a visa those days. But he came to the United States. And in 1947, he married Ray Rader. This picture was taken on their wedding day in Chattanooga, Tennessee. She was a widow with a 6-year-old daughter. This picture was taken in 1959. That little girl became my sister Lois, and she took this picture. That's the rest of us. My father, myself, my sister Sylvia, and my mother. We were dressed up to go to a wedding somewhere. But my father built that home. We're standing on the front porch. He built that house. He built hundreds of homes in the Chattanooga area. He developed entire subdivisions. He was a general contractor. He designed the homes. He supervised their construction. He sold them himself. He was his own real estate agent. He was a highly successful businessman. So there you have it. The story of a German-born Polish Jew who fought with the Italian partisans, survived the Holocaust, and went on to live the American dream. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions you may have.